Good evening, everybody. Good evening. If you'd open to Joshua chapter 23. Joshua chapter 23. We are going to wrap up the book of Joshua tonight. We'll be finishing the book of Joshua. On Sunday, of course, we'll begin our evangelism seminar with Rob Whitaker, and so certainly if you're able to be here Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or any of that, we'd love for you to come out and join us in that. And then next Wednesday evening, we'll be starting looking in Bible class. Now that we finished Joshua, we'll be looking at the life of Jesus. Last year we looked at a portion of it, and so this year we'll look at another portion of the life of Jesus starting next Wednesday evening. But tonight we are in Joshua chapter 23, and as we have worked our way from chapter 1 all the way here to the end, we have found over and over again the reoccurring theme of primarily courage, the idea of clinging tighter to God, that courage comes from our nearness to God. It comes from when things get hard or when we're afraid, not of pulling away, but of drawing closer to God. And of course, one of the most difficult times and one of the most trying times, I think, to draw closer to God is in times of temptation. And that's really, Joshua addresses that in chapter 23. I think maybe verses 1 and 2 are my favorite verses in all of the Bible. Joshua 23 and verse 1, it says, "It came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. And so Joshua called for all Israel and for the elders and for their heads and for their judges and for their officers. And he said to him, I am old, advanced in age." And I don't know, that just entertains me that they repeat it like that. But Joshua knows he's very old and advanced in age. And so here at the end of his life, just like Moses did this right there before the end of his life. Joshua is going to encourage the next generation. He's going to give them some last warnings and last encouragement to help them. And he starts with the idea of remembering that their success has always been from God. And so if they expect to have success in the future, they should expect to find it from the same source. Verse 3 says, "You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has fought for you. See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off, as far as the great sea westward. And the Lord God will expel them from before you and drive them out of your sight, and so you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you." And so he says this has always been the source of your success, and if you'll let him, he will continue to be the source of success. That God is not just a God of a generation, but the next generation can count on God in the same way that the previous generation did. And that, I think, is just a tremendous blessing to think that when we raise up our children to walk in his ways, and when they choose to do that, God is just as faithful for them as he is for us. And so we can count on him. Whenever I think about my kids growing up and being, responsible for themselves, and whenever I think about the day when I may not be capable of doing things for them anymore, or I won't even be here, I don't know about you, but to me, and my kids are young, to me that's kind of a scary thought. I just want to be there for my kids, and I just want to do things for them. But there is a great degree of comfort of thinking, even when I can't or won't be anymore, God still will, and he can take better care of them than I can. And so I think, there's a lot of comfort in that he is just so consistent. And so he continues in verse 6, and he says, "Therefore," and here we find what we have found over and over and over again in the book of Joshua, "be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses." Now, this has been the point all along, but let's just look at it one more time here. When he talks about courage, in particular, what does he want them to have courage for in verse 6? What is the courage directed at? Obedience and trusting God and that being faithful and doing what God has said sometimes takes a great deal of courage. And we think about courage of Joshua to fight battles. We think about courage for all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, courage is very much really just about our faithfulness, just to stay with God, to continue with God. And that takes courage in and of himself. It says that to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand, or you go from it to the left hand, lest you go among these nations, these who remain among you. You shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them. You shall not serve them or bow down to them, but you shall hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. And so he says, once I'm gone, right? I think that's the fear for parents when they think about their children, or when they think about their children growing up, is once you're no longer in my home, or once I'm gone, you're going to choose something different. You're going to choose to follow something else. And I think Joshua is kind of having these same thoughts here, saying, I know that you will face temptations. I know that there's all these temptations out there among the people who surround us, who are going to try to pull you into worshiping their gods and doing things their way. I know that there are people around us who will try to convince our children, convince us to do things their way, or to follow that path of life. And he says, all we have to do, hold fast to the Lord your God as you have been. He's given you the success all this time. Amidst temptation, cling closer to God. I'm going to try to quote this song. It's like on the tip of my tongue, and I've been trying to think of it the whole time I've been talking. But the lyrics go something to the effect of, whenever it is that I need you most, that's when I tend to pull away. A song that I'm not sure that we sung it here, but it's a hymn that we might sing in worship or something. And it says, it tends to be, isn't it, that whenever we need God the most, that's when we tend to look elsewhere. That's when we tend to pull away. And the point of the song is sort of that's when we need more than anything to reach out and to grab on tighter, to pull closer to God when we feel that temptation. And so verse 9, he says, the Lord has driven out from among you great and strong nations, but as for you, remember the success. No one has been able to stand against you to this day. One man of you shall chase 1,000. That's an amazing thought, isn't it? In battle, one person chasing 1,000 people and winning. That's impossible unless you have the power of God behind you. And sometimes I think temptation can feel that way, can it? It can feel like 1,000 soldiers who are trying to get you to do something you shouldn't do. And he says, one man of you can chase 1,000. You can overcome these things. For the Lord your God, verse 10, he is the God who fights for you, as he has promised you. Therefore take careful heed to yourselves, that you love the Lord your God. And notice, a lot of times people talk about the Old Testament, and they talk about the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament is all about rules, and the Old Testament is all about law, and the New Testament is all about love, and the New Testament is all about grace and mercy. But notice what Moses says here. What is going to keep them faithful? What is going to keep them motivated? What is going to keep them on track in verse 11? Their love for the Lord. Even in the Old Testament, this is still the emphasis. It's very much the emphasis of Deuteronomy. Joshua continues it here. That it's more than just because you make us successful. It's more than just because you fulfill your promises. It's more than just because you're bigger and badder than all the other options that we know of. It's because they love the Lord. Take careful heed to love the Lord your God, or else, verse 12, if indeed you do go back and you cling, no, go back to verse 8 and remember what he said. Hold fast, cling to the Lord your God, or else, verse 12, if you cling to the remnant of these nations, these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go into them, and they to you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, scourges on your sides, thorns in your eyes, until you perish from the good land which the Lord your God has given you. And sometimes I think it's easy to read that and say, well, that doesn't really sound very fair, does it? Why is it that God is for them and then suddenly God is against them? But notice how he described it. He says, if you cling, this is the choice they made. When we choose the things of the world, when we choose temptation, God doesn't step in and say, I'm not going to let you commit that sin. I'm not gonna force you to obey me. God lets us choose what we want, doesn't he? He allows us to make those choices for ourselves. But aren't there just natural consequences to making those choices? Isn't it true that when we make those choices, we're bound to, you know, the New Testament calls it you reap what you sow. You know, you're bound to reap whatever it is that you have been sowing. And so these are just the natural consequences when we give into that, and especially he talks about it in verse 13 of or verse 12. They're making marriages. It's not just like a one-time kind of mistake. This is something they've committed to. This is something that they are following pretty wholeheartedly. And so, in essence, he says, in the past, your success, if you've ever been successful, it's always been with God. And God is ready to continue to give you that success if during these temptations you will cling to him. But, in essence, he's saying here, the choice is yours. You get to decide. And that's very much, we'll look at that in a moment, what he says more plainly in chapter 24. But before we finish this chapter, any thoughts about what we've looked at so far? Sure. That's in Proverbs, but yes. No, you're good. It's in there, yes, ma'am. That's right. Somewhere in the Bible. Yeah. Yes, yeah. I think that's very much what Joshua has done, and we'll see when we get to the end of chapter 24 that it's a very positive effect. He's a good example of how that works well sometimes. If you train someone up in a certain way, they're more likely to stick with it, or at least to come back to it eventually. And while we have to keep in mind that the Proverbs are they're general principles of how things usually work, and not like a ironclad. If you do it this way, it will always work out this way. We have to leave room for human will, but that this is most of the time a true fact, and that's certainly what Joshua has done for them here. He's showed them the example. It's not just that he's told them to hold fast to God, but hasn't he lived it for so long in front of them? And I think that's a big part of when you think about training up somebody is, did your dad ever say, do what I say and not what I do? And you always ended up in the long run doing what he did, don't you? That's how that typically goes. Is maybe for a minute you do what he say because he's the authority and you have to, but in the long run you do things the way that you saw people do it. It's one thing if Joshua had just said these things, but they've watched his example. They've watched him cling to God through all of the difficulties, through the loss at AI, and through all of the other things that have happened. And they've seen that God always was on Joshua's side. God always gave Joshua that victory. And I think that's a big part of what motivated them to stick with him even after Joshua died. Right. Mm-hmm. It's learned, yeah. And any behavior can be unlearned, and something can replace it. But there's always that uphill battle of what you're trained to do is what your instinct will be, at least for a time. And some people don't ever make it all the way past that hump, And so, yeah, I think that's a good point. Yes.
I asked this, the past weeks too, but he's always reminding them not to follow false gods. But I just wonder what was so appealing, and what was the benefit to these false gods?
That's a good question. I'm sorry. Well, I think that's true. There was some degree that maybe their laws weren't quite as hard to follow, or even that in some ways, Hebrews 11 talks about the passing pleasure of sin. Some of their worship ceremonies were very sinful in a way that is appealing to people, and you can probably get the gist of that. And so there's some of that. But I think the biggest thing about it is that you just want to survive life, right? You want to provide for your kids, you want to provide for your wife, and so there are things that are outside of your control. You put the crop in the ground, but you don't make it rain. You can work hard and then not have any water. You can try very hard and never have a baby to carry on your line. You want all of these things, and all of the different cultures had their gods that claimed that this God could give you those things. And so if you hit a hard patch in life, do you stick with the true God, or do you bail to a God who you think might give you what he's not giving you? Or, try to serve both of them and see if maybe you can get double the benefits, or, and so the appeal was the,
Short-term fix.
yes, yeah, to problems, that's right.
Yeah, I can see why exactly you answer that question.
Sure.
It's bothering me for years too, but there's also the physical thing, they could actually see it.
Yeah,
Something about putting up this image in front of them.
the idol.
They see it and, follow it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And some of these idols even were, not all of them, but in the bigger places, the bigger cities, these idols were, just massive, huge statues. And yeah, you see something like that and it kind of strikes awe in you, and they were very superstitious kind of people. And so, yeah.
I would think that there's also an element here, that we're kind of wanting to repeat right now.
Sure. Yes, I think you're right.
That is, when society has sinful ways, for whatever reason, we tend to be tolerant.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, the things that you tolerate in this generation will be commonplace in the next generation.
Right.
Is one of the old sayings.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that there are a lot of the societal pressures of these peoples that they were conquering,
Yes.
living amongst, all
That,
of a sudden become part of their life.
that's a big part of why the original plan was to destroy all of that, so that there was no societal pressure that could kind of seep into the culture like that over time. And certainly you see that that's exactly what happens. That's if you ever like a song that you really hate on the radio, but they play it a lot, and once you listen to it enough, you kind of get to where you don't mind it so much anymore. What you see or hear often becomes comfortable to you. And so I think that's very much Johnny.
It's a lot like many of the religions today they have back then. It allows you to do things that God does not allow.
Right.
I think about the Muslim religion. It allows you to hate. It
Right.
allows you to cheat. It allows you to discriminate. It allows you to do things in that religion's name.
Sure.
And that's what a lot of people want to do anyway.
They just want to do it their way.
Right?
So they find someone that's the itching ears of 1 Timothy 4. You find someone who says, do it this way, and you think, that's not what I want to do anyway. And so that sounds good, let's do it that way. As opposed to, there's a reason why God says this way is better, and I'm going to trust that and know that if I do it that way, it's going to work out better ultimately. Yeah, I think that's very true. So, all right. Well, he picks up in verse 14 then. That's a good question, Zach. Thank you. And he says, behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth. He's dying is what he's saying. And you know in your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you. He said this before at the end of sort of the dividing up the land. God accomplished everything he said that he would. All has come to pass for you, and not one word of them has failed. Therefore, verse 15, it shall come to pass that as all the good things have come upon you which the Lord your God promised you, so the Lord will bring you upon you all harmful things until he has destroyed you for this good land which the Lord your God has given you. And that's in Romans chapter 11, God calls it the goodness and severity of God. Basically the idea of God, we know that he wants to save all of humanity. 1 Peter 3 and verse 9 says, that's why he's patient and long suffering with us. His desire is for all men to be saved. But what God has said is always true. And so all of the good things that God has said, if we commit our ways to him, that is certainly true, and he will deliver all of them, just like he did here. It says all of it. God gave you all of it. But when God says that there are consequences to rejecting it, he is just as equally serious about that. And sometimes I think people feel like, well, God said these things, and God said these things, and, he's just going to do good to everybody, and there's not going to be any of those consequences. They want to take this seriously. They don't want to take the other side seriously. And Joshua's point here is, if God says it, it's true. And he has said both. And so if he will fulfill every promise, that's good. He will fulfill every consequence that's bad if you choose that path instead. And there's no, well, it doesn't really matter what I do. God's just going to do this over here. He is perfectly serious about both. And it talks about the fear of the Lord. It's the idea of trusting that what God said on both sides are equally true, and therefore choosing to follow this way because you know that his way is best.
So he says, don't be lukewarm.
Lukewarm, that's a good example of that. And Jesus tells one of the churches in Revelation chapter 3 in those letters, he says that he wants to spit them out of his mouth. He'd rather them be hot or cold, but not lukewarm. Yeah, it's they've mixed themselves in with the world, and that's not, Jesus says either you're with me or against me. There's no kind of middle ground there. So in verse 16, he says, when you have transgressed the covenant from the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. And they saw this example after example. There was Korah's rebellion in Numbers chapter 16. There was Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10. They've seen this happen before. They know Joshua is right. This is exactly how it is. And so, and in essence, I think what he's saying here is this new generation that's sort of coming up after the people who conquered the land, they've got to make their faith their own now. They're going to be the ones who are sort of, as Joshua in this generation begins to die off, they're going to be the ones that now decide, do we stick with God, or do we choose a different path? And that's really, every generation has to decide that for themselves, ultimately. What the things that we are doing here today at this church, hopefully the next generation continues to do the right things. But when we are all gone, they're just going to do what they're going to do, and we don't say boo about it. We don't have anything other than the influence that we are now expressing. And so Joshua's saying, you've got to make this for yourself. You've got to know that it's your turn to step up and to decide which way are you going to go. And you can look at all of the examples up to this point, and you can look at everything that you've seen in your own life, and you can see the evidence. We've given you all the evidence. God's way is always best. But you've got to know that whatever you choose, God is faithful. He is going to do what he said he's going to do, no matter which one you choose. And so it's their time to kind of make their faith their own and choose for themselves. So before chapter 24, any thoughts or comments about that?
Or it reminds me of things in Proverbs where it says, fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
Yes, sir. That's absolutely it. Yeah. I like that because it's the beginning of wisdom, right? It doesn't mean you are wise. It means you've begun the trek to becoming wise. And so, and it starts there, because without that fear, which is really, like I said, just a way of saying, without knowing, God is perfectly serious about both sides of things. Without that, you'll never take it seriously, and you'll never really have wisdom, because you'll never really have a reason to if you don't believe that God is perfectly serious about both his good promises and the consequences that follow if you reject God. But if you take that seriously, that's the beginning of wisdom. And so, yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yes, sir.
At this time, God has given them cities,
Yes.
homes,
Mm-hmm.
vineyards. He's given them all this land that they didn't build.
Right.
And you said evidence, the evidence over and over
Yes.
and over, conquering armies, and God is a jealous God.
Sure.
He wants to be honored. He wants to be worshipped. He's not going to continue to give them things when they turn to other gods.
Right.
Who gives them nothing.
Right. Yeah.
And this idea of you have clearly seen the things that I have done for you. And so it's like us as if we were a parent, to give and help, and if they turn their back on you and serve something else,
Mm-hmm.
would that hurt us?
Sure.
Well, it hurts God.
Right.
He wants to be honored. He wants to be acknowledged. And he's telling them here, as Joshua is about to pass on, he's been his spokesman. Now he's telling them, like, okay, this is what God wants in return.
Right.
To continue to acknowledge me and to honor me and worship me and keep these commandments. By keeping these, I'm going to continue to
Mm-hmm.
bless you.
I think
as
so.
I have in the past.
As I had, the evidence is all there. I think so. Yeah. He did give them, far beyond the 2 or 3 witnesses of evidence that is requested. It's just an overabundance of evidence. And you think, what is God jealous for? And he's right. God, he says, I'm a jealous God. And really, what he's jealous for, you think he says, my commandments are for your good. God knows, because he created us, because he knows everything, exactly what is best for our lives. And what he's really jealous for is, if you've ever had a kid, or if you've ever known anyone who you could see that they were going down a path that was going to hurt them, and you think, if I could just reach out and just turn it, if I could just do something to stop them from hurting them, from taking that path, going in the wrong direction, whatever it may be, I would just do it. Now God knows better, but I would just reach out and do it if I could. And God is jealous to see us take the best path in life, and that's his path because he cares so much for us. That's his path because he made us. He knows what's best for us, and he proved it by sending his son to die for us. And so he is jealous to see us succeed. And the best path forward for succeeding is these boundaries, this law, this covenant that he gave us, because he wants so much for our salvation and for our security and for our eternal relationship with him. And so he is jealous because he cares so much for us. In the same way that we want so badly to see people not go down a bad path for their own lives, and we would do anything to stop them if we could. He has that same kind of love and jealousy, if you think of it that way. And that's it. Yes, sir.
And he even warns us, condemning us, that if we turn away from him, that he will raise up other nations.
Right.
Punish us.
Yeah, and that's I think punishment certainly is a part of it. You think that's that eternal punishment. And when at this time period, I like to use really the word discipline more. You think that's what a parent does. A parent doesn't punish their kids. A parent disciplines, because discipline is about teaching, and punishment is about retribution. No, I'm not. I agree with you, but I think sometimes the word punish carries like an idea in people's mind that accurate or inaccurate, punishment carries an idea in people's mind. And so I think punishment is about meting out justice because someone has done wrong. Discipline is about teaching someone, and that's, I want you to do better next time. And I think sometimes we do see God punish. He is the judge. He has the right to, and that's, Korah was punished for what he did. But most of the time what you see is God disciplining. He's teaching people because they have the chance to repent. They have the chance to turn it around. And so, yes.
Punishment also brings to mind the connotation of harm.
Yes, it does. And that's, you think punishment is what God does eternally. That's the eternal separation because you rejected him completely.
But I get what he's saying.
Yes, yeah.
We didn't get disciplined, we got punished.
Yeah.
Oh, it's punished your honey.
Right, yes, yeah. They're certainly interchangeable words, but punishment does carry a certain connotation. So I like to use them differently, especially in a public atmosphere, just because I think sometimes people can walk away with a bad taste in their mouth about God, but they, don't want to be too nitpicky. So yes. And that is absolutely true. Yeah, Johnny.
We often forget that Joshua is the only person alive, possibly of Caleb, of his generation.
Yes, that's right.
No one else is that. They all died in the wilderness.
Right. That's right.
No one else is his equal. No one else is has the wisdom he has, or is in the line he's on. And we forget that when he's writing this, it's important to him at the end of his life. I have nobody.
He's the last of his generation.
This younger generation.
That's right. Yeah. And we're going to see in just a moment how effective that was, and that they valued that from him so much. So, all right, chapter 24 picks up, and he begins to talk about the idea of influence, and he's going to give us several examples. And for the sake of time, we're going to run through them fairly quickly. But it starts with the idea that really carries through the idea that your bad influences can really come from anywhere. And it starts with bad influences can come from your own past family members, the people who raised you, or your ancestors. Talking about, look at there in verse 2, he says, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. Right? And so he's going to make the point later, you can choose to serve those gods if you want to, but we see how that works out. And so sometimes people say, well, I can't do this. I can't do this or that in the Bible because that's not how my parents did it. That's not how my grandparents did it. We've been, we've done these things this way for X generations. And Joshua here says, if Abraham had said that, we would not have the promised land. If Abraham had said, I'm not going to go do this because Terah, my dad, serves this God in this place, and I have to do things how my family does it, Abraham would not be in the Bible. We would not know his name today. He would not be the father of faith, as some people call him, and sometimes it requires rejecting the faith that we grew up with. Sometimes it requires rejecting what our parents taught us or what somebody taught us that we value, because they can be bad influences if they're not teaching us the things that God is teaching us in the Bible. In verses 3 through 7, he talks about how our culture can be a bad influence, and he's going to talk a little bit about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and we know some of the struggles they had. But then especially in verses 5 through 7, he's going to talk about Egypt. And they carried a lot of baggage from Egypt. They brought idol worshiping from Egypt. They brought all kinds of things from Egypt. And of course, just the attitude about, we'd rather go back to the watermelons of Egypt than die out here in the wilderness when they were following Moses. And that our culture can be a bad influence. And sometimes people kind of have the attitude that, if all these people are doing it, it can't be wrong. Or if, this is what my friends are doing, or this is what, these famous people are doing, and so it must be okay. And Joshua, and all of the wisdom and life that he has, says, your culture can really steer you astray. Remember the plagues in Egypt and how God, clearly did not approve of what they were doing in Egypt. Your culture can lead you astray. In verse 8, he describes how he brought them into the land of all of these people, these kind of strangers. And so, this is the stranger danger kind of idea, that strangers can certainly be bad influence. And then in a contrast to that, in verses 9 through 10, there's people who were familiar with God and people that they were kind of familiar with, like Balak and Balaam. And even friendly faces can be bad influences. Your best friend, whom you've known for your whole life since you were in grade school, can lead you astray. People that you know very well and that you think that you should be able to trust are not always the people that are telling you the same thing that God is telling you. And then in verses 11 through 12, he talks about how there are all these nations, people who are different from you, those from the outside. They can be bad influences. And then even in verse 13, the people who are just right there at home with you, the people who you're closest to. And the idea is there's really nowhere else you can turn to know for certain what God's word says other than God himself. He kind of covers every kind of person that you could think of, from your family to your neighbors to your enemies to strangers, every kind of person you could think of. And he says it doesn't necessarily mean they're leading you astray, but you can't just say, well, I know this is right because so-and-so said it. I know this is right because I've always been taught this. And this is a thing that people really do say. You can't take that for granted, because you will waver in your faith. You will fall away from what God said if that becomes your attitude. Instead, he contrasts that with verses 14 and 15 of, you've got to know and choose for yourself. Verse 14, now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity, serve him in truth. It is very much like John 4:24, that worship me in spirit and in truth. Serve him in sincerity and in truth. You know what he says, and you want to do what he says. Put away the gods which your father served on the other side of the river. That was Abraham's father. And in Egypt, serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, if you look at all the evidence and you just say, I don't think I can, I don't think he's a good guy, I don't think this is right. If it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose who you will serve. Are you going to serve the gods that your father served? Are you going to serve the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell? And that's sort of God had defeated all of them. And so, it's sort of a jab. But he's really saying, this is your choice. As for me and my house, we've made this choice. We know what we're going to do. We will serve the Lord. And so, it's your choice. So make the choice. And then he says, stick with it. That's as for me and my house, we know. Make the choice and stick with what's right. And he follows that. The people say, no, we're going to serve the Lord. And kind of the idea of what he says is, God is the clear choice. If you're really honest with yourself, if you're really looking at the evidence, he's the only choice that you really can make. And so he is worth committing to. And sometimes people, they read through what God's word says and they say, I don't know if I can do all of that. I don't know if I can make those changes. I don't know if I can change this relationship or change this action in my life. I don't know if I can do all that. And the point he kind of makes here is it's worth it. It's always worth it to follow God, because if you're not following God, what are you following? If you're not following the only one who can give you victory in life, this thing that you're clinging to, that you need to change in order to be on the best path, what is it going to save you from? And so he says God is worth following. All right, I know I kind of blew through that. Any thoughts or comments before we move on?
It's kind of an awful feeling when you know the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Because, the kings are coming and the split.
Mm-hmm.
And he's taking each of these tribes, he's taking some of these tribes together and says, follow the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're supposed to go in there and wipe out all those people with those idols.
Right.
So it's disheartening for the guy who took a whole country in and nation, and they took over and the best land on earth.
They lost so much ground so quickly. Yeah. That's what sin does. It causes us to lose so much ground so quickly. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, going back to what we were talking about, like with sometimes you have to kind of abandon what your parents taught you or your friends or whatever.
Sure.
It made me think about in Mark chapter 7 when they talk about the traditions
Mm-hmm.
and how it says, in vain do they worship me, teaching us doctrines the commandments of men.
Yeah.
You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. It makes me think about some of the things some people do today and some of the things we even do today.
Right.
That we've done that for years.
Yes.
And they're
We've
not
always done it that way.
right.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily right, and they might not necessarily be wrong. But we talked about this in the young adults class a couple weeks ago.
Right.
About how are we really thinking about the things that we're doing, the things that we do for years? Are we really studying about those things and asking God about those things?
No, I think that's a good point. And that's Jesus says there in Mark 7. That they teach the doctrines of men, and that's man's religion. This is not what God commanded. This is what somebody else commanded. And I think you're right to say that even sometimes the things that God commanded can, in a sense, become man's religion, because we don't even know why we're doing it anymore. We're just doing it because we've always done it that way. And that's whenever you hear someone say something effective, why can't we do this? Well, we've never done it that way before. That's kind of a scary thing to hear, really, because that says I'm not open to really understanding why. I just do what I've always done. And if you just do what you've always done, you might be doing something wrong and not know it. And so there's kind of a terrifying thought in that. And I think that's a very good observation when you think about who Joshua is talking to, and that to a new generation. And I think sometimes it is hard to sometimes when people ask questions, well, why do we do it this way? Or what if we did it this other way? What that feels like people are saying is, you're doing it wrong, and I'm going to change everything. And maybe that's what they're saying. But in most cases, I don't think that's what people are really trying to say. They're trying to say, we don't yet understand why, and we wish someone to understand why we're doing it this way. And to ask the question why doesn't mean we have to make a change at the end of it. To ask the question why, we might find out we're doing exactly the right thing, and that we're going to keep on doing the right thing. But once we know why we're doing it, we have the confidence that we are doing it that way. And maybe older generations know why, and they are sure of that. But how can the younger generation know why if they're not asking those questions and no one is showing them why as well? And that's, I think, how Joshua was faithful. We'll see in a minute at the end of the chapter, the next generation was faithful, but the generation after that was not. Why were they not faithful? Probably because nobody told that generation what Joshua told this generation. Okay.
I agree. Nothing matters. I agree.
Oh, well, no,
but I do agree that you should always ask why. But that's two-way street.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Because you also should ask, why do you want to change?
Yeah, and that's. I think, yeah. I don't even think. Yeah, the question really, at least what I was trying to, is not even necessarily why so that we can change, but just Why? So we can understand, and only change if we find reason to.
And
Yeah.
then there's that old saying, it's kind of safe. It ain't broke.
Yeah.
Just trying to fix it.
Yes. I think that's sometimes you can ask too many questions. Yeah, I think that's true too. Absolutely.
It separates, in fact, the tradition from doing it by faith.
That's exactly it. Yeah. You always want to be raising up a new generation of people who do things by faith and not just because, well, we told you to do it this way, you know. And there's certainly a maturity level there as far as you've got to start somewhere, you know. You've got to tell people what to do in the beginning, but that you're always working toward, I can hand this off to you and you can keep it going because you understand why, because I know I'm not going to be here forever. And that's kind of what you see Joshua doing here. He's passing on that baton with more than just because I said so, but here's why.
I always like the question why,
Uh-huh.
because it also helps me to be accountable.
Sure.
And have the answer ready.
Yes.
At all times while we do the things we do.
Yeah.
But it also broadens the understanding of those that don't know the reason.
That's right. It's always, why is really always just a learning opportunity. And that 1 Peter 3:15, you know, it's sanctify the Lord God in your heart, so you're always ready to give a defense when people ask you, why do you do this, you know?
Are we told also in Scripture to always test all things?
Test all things, that's right. And so, you know, everything we do, nothing that we do is above scrutiny. And it's always good for the elders and everyone to step back and say, do I really know why we're doing this? And is it really, and maybe at one time it was the exact way to do it, but maybe we've outgrown that and we need something, you know, not that we're ever replacing God's word, but you know, for those things that we have, this is the tradition, there's nothing wrong with it, but maybe it doesn't serve the purpose that it once did. You know, it helps us to kind of keep from doing things for man's tradition. Yeah.
Not to get too far off on this.
No,
but I
you're
had
fine.
a conversation with Jason one time. And, you know, if you got a group of 25 year, you know, 30 and younger to start a congregation, and they go by the same guidelines, and you put it in another country, well, there's a good chance they're not going to have pews like this. They're not
Right.
going to have the table up
Yeah.
there. They're not going to have a podium.
That's right.
They're not going to sing the same songs. But is it right? You know, probably so.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. You know, it's the what's best for the circumstances we're in today, and why is it best? You know, what's the best path forward for us? That might look different in a different generation or a different place. Yeah, that's right. In spirit and truth. Yeah.
Years ago, when I worked at Skaggs Alpha Beta, there was a lady I worked with there that was also a member of the church. She and I were discussing one of the bosses that we had in the establishment. She was telling me about going home and telling her mother about it. And her mother said, well, no matter what you come to and agree with what your boss is, you're going to always have a boss, because God is the boss.
Right, that's right. And that's, try to pass that on to the next generation as far as this is what we're doing and this is why, you know, pointing back to the scripture and saying this is what's best, this is what's right, and carry that forward, keep carrying that forward. That's right, yeah. So, all right, he kind of wraps things up then, starting in verse 24. They say, yes, we will serve God, we will obey, and so they made that covenant. Joshua in verse 26 writes it all down. This is where, you know, he finishes off basically most of the rest of the book of Joshua, and he puts it there in the sanctuary of the Lord. And he says in verse 27, behold, this stone shall be a witness to us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord which he spoke to us. It shall therefore be a witness to you, lest you deny your God. And so Joshua let the people depart, each to his own inheritance. And so the covenant, putting it there before the altar, is to say this is something that we are saying we will do forever. As long as we are alive, we are committed. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua then leaves this great legacy. It's a legacy that, you know, the next generation can follow. In verse 29, it says, after these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him within the border of the inheritance of Timnath-Serah, which is in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gaash. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, but then all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had known all the works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. And that's, you know, really the mark of a good leader is that, you know, when he's there, they're doing it right, but then even when he's gone, they continue to do it right. If everything just goes back to how it was before he was there, when he leaves, he probably wasn't that effective of leader. And so Joshua has left this legacy that they understand it well enough to continue the work, even if he's not there anymore. And it's a legacy that those who in the past cared about what was right, they could respect what Joshua did. And that's kind of the idea of verse 32 when it says they brought Joseph, they repeat this idea, they brought Joseph's bones and they did just exactly what Joseph asked them to do, fulfilled all of those things. And then verse 33, you have Eleazar the son of Aaron, and he dies, that's the high priest, and they buried him in a hill belonging to Phinehas his son, which was given to him in the mountains of Ephraim. And the idea there is that he was buried with honor. They weren't ashamed to have his tombstone right there on family ground where everyone can see. And so this is a legacy worth honoring, worth remembering, worth recording, worth learning from and benefiting from, because it's one that can still be followed today. And so when you have this sort of training up of the next generation that helps them to keep moving forward with it, then that's something that God takes note of and something that God is pleased with and that benefits so many people. And that really, I think, is Joshua, through all the course of his life, benefited so many people because he really just wanted people to do what was best, and that was always God's path. And he really just tried to live that himself. And he made mistakes, certainly, we saw that, but he always just tried to do what was right and to cling tighter to God, no matter how bad the temptations, no matter how bad the struggles, no matter how bad it got. He just held on tighter and tighter. All right, any last thoughts or comments here? All right, we will wrap it up there. And as we said, next week we'll be looking at the life of Jesus again.
At what?